door as well. So hello, my name is Greg Paskal. I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee right now. I work for this amazing company called Ramsey Solutions, home of the Dave Ramsey Show. Some of you might know our show. I'm really honored to be asked by ASTQB to share with you today this testing approach I created. You know, it really helped me out a lot, and I think it's going to help you out as well. It's called METS, and METS simply stands for the Minimal Essential Testing Strategy. It's really simple. It's an effective testing methodology, and you can implement it right away, regardless of the size or the maturity of your testing organization. It's really pretty easy to get going. Today, we're going to cover three main things. We're going to talk about the basic METS concepts, just so you get your arms around kind of the mechanics of it. Then we're going to work through how you would begin to build your own METS tool. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and talk about some advanced METS concepts, because some of you out there are wired to always push those boundaries. I'm the same way, and that's how this tool's continue to evolve and serve teams like the one I'm on right now. So let's go ahead and jump on in and get started. Let's begin with the story I believe most of you can identify with, and let's call it a day in the life of a QA engineer. All right, little sound effect here. Ring, ring, as my phone rings. Hello? Adam? Hey, what's going on? You have an email change for me? Well, how many pages did you make this change on, Adam? Just the press releases, huh? Aren't there like 40 of those press releases, if I remember right? 48 of them? Wait, I guess they grew since I was on them last. So when do you need them done by? Noon? Noon today? That's like in an hour or so from now. Noon, huh? Oh well. Okay. So I bet all of us have had this happen as QA folks. It's just the nature of the work we do. You get that call, and you're given a really short amount of time to perform the testing miracle. And this is exactly what happened to me as that new QA guy. And I realized I had to do something about it. So here's the challenge. We all face this. Frequently, these sort of changes, they come up. You might have one a week. You might have a couple of them a week. Sometimes more rare than that, but all of us know what it's like to get these. And there's always a minimal amount of time for sufficient test coverage. And this last one is one that I think is unfortunate about the nature of QA, but it's a reality we all deal with. And that's that there's unrealistic expectations of what we can do in a certain amount of time given. It just comes with the job. So, you know, the problem that we're running into is this. So when someone comes to you and I and they say, hey, I just changed an email link, for them, they're thinking, yeah, this takes this guy probably a couple minutes. He's just looking at a link. What's the big deal? But you and I both know, as QA engineers, we're wired to think of a lot of other questions than just is the link working. So some common ones we probably would be thinking about is, yeah, certainly is the link working. But what about, does it launch the email client? Right? Just because you can see it on a page doesn't mean it's going to launch the client. We've all seen that. What about the person that's going to? Is it going to the right person to begin with? And of course, has anything else been impacted? As far as we know, maybe the developer did a search and replace across 48 pages and just said, change this text with this other text. And they consider that being done. And you and I know that those changes can affect other pages. So what makes a QA tester unique to begin with? Well, if you're like me, we all tend to ask these sort of questions. We're asking the why, we're asking what all the time, and how. Those are just things that come to us all the time. I'm driving down the road, I'm thinking, why is that sign like that? Or why does this traffic light work like this? It's just the nature of the way we're wired. And here's a real-world example of that. I call it the $5,000 giveaway example. So I was working for a company, and they made this page change. And on it, they introduced a new contest we were running. We were giving $5,000 away. Pretty cool, especially for the guy that was going to get the $5,000. So to enter the contest, all you needed to do was dial, you guessed it, an 800 number. Well, maybe some people would just look at that and say, well, there's an 800 number, but me as a QA guy, I thought, I got to call this number. I want to see who's on the other end to begin with and to make sure that they know what's going on. So sure enough, I dialed it, and you'll never guess what happened. This nice lady answered it with a friendly hello, and I shared who I was and that I was actually testing this number, that it was going to someone that knew it was about to start ringing off the hook. And as you could guess, this lady had no idea that the number was going to go to her phone, and it actually was a defect. Somehow along the way, something wasn't set up proper with the 800 number. So fortunately we caught it before we published it, and we got it fixed. But the moral of this story is, good QA testers, we typically test things more than just the low-hanging fruit. We're wired to go in and look for those fine-grained details that often go overlooked. So as a new QA engineer, I was really enjoying the world of testing. What's great about testing is as you get into it, you find there are all these nuances of certain types of things you never even knew to begin with. I find even my wife is learning how to test. As I come home and I share things with her, she'll find all kinds of bugs throughout the day. Look at what's broken with the television remote or something like that. We keep finding all these different opportunities to find defects. So as I was going through this process of learning to be a tester, and also the reality of the chaos of these things getting thrown over the wall, I knew I needed to do something. I needed a different process. So I'm an organizer by nature. If you look at my garage today, you're going to see racks and racks of shelves and dozens of these plastic boxes with lids on them. And likely you're going to find boxes inside of those boxes. I'm just that way. I create lists for things, and I'm an organizer. And I think that's what helps me in my testing ability, is I'm always wanting to think of things that way and be very thorough. So I decided I was going to go ahead and create a list. And I grabbed a yellow tablet like this one on the screen, and I just started writing down, hey, next time something gets thrown over the wall, make sure you check this. Make sure you check this. Just one at a time, no big deal. Remember, I'm still really new to QA, so I don't even know a lot of the terminology at that point. And the list continued to grow, and then one day I realized, guys, I had something in my hands. I had what turned out to be the METS concept. And so I took that list, as you can see here, this simple yellow list, and I put it in a spreadsheet. And this is obviously a pretty mature version of that now. But when it started off, it literally was just some categories and some tests to run. And as I began to use it more and more, more pieces of the puzzle came together. METS was officially born. So METS stands for Minimal Essential Test Strategy, and it's a strategy of being prepared when those things get thrown over the wall. METS addresses a common myth we all run into in the QA and testing world, and that is also that the idea that everything can be tested. METS gives us a strategy for that sort of unrealistic mindset. As you'll see, METS gives us a tool and brings awareness of all the testing possibilities. And it also provides a great way to add new tests as time goes on. That's built into it by nature. METS is a strategy. It's all about being prepared for the inevitable. Work is going to get thrown over the wall. You know it. It might have happened 10 minutes before this phone call. It's just the nature of the work that we do. But having this METS in place, it's going to give you a battle plan for when that happens. It's being prepared. So METS, it's not something you're going to buy off the shelf. As a matter of fact, you can download the basic METS grids right off of my website. We're going to share that here in a few minutes. It's not related to an automated process, and obviously it's not a silver bullet. Doesn't solve all your problems. But METS will meet many of your needs. And you're going to find that it's going to complement the existing QA strategy. You don't have to settle for one or the other. This blends in so well, even if you're a very mature QA shop. Think of it as just another tool in your QA tool belt. And if you only have one tool, add this as your second. And it's going to be a great help for you in exploratory testing, one of my favorite types of testing, and most QA folks love to do this type of testing. METS gives you a great way to remember areas you want to do for exploratory. All right, so let's talk about a few fundamental foundational concepts when we're talking about METS. And I'd like for you to step back as we're going through these and kind of envision your application, the one you're working with every day, and how some of these things, how you could kind of see some of these things coming through as we would build out a METS grid. So one of the first things when it comes to METS, one of the foundational concepts is the aspect of identification. How do humans identify things? Consider this, most things can be viewed from at least a couple perspectives. Two of them that stand out to me right away would be the physical attributes, things like maybe a button or a field, and then the functional things, you know, how something works. So maybe from a functional perspective, how something starts or stops, or the ability to put something in a cart or check something out. Finding these attributes that help you identify aspects of your application is a really important part of the METS concept. So let's use this minivan for an example, and we're going to just look at this minivan from the physical aspects for the moment, okay? So we know that a van like this has got to have tires. If it doesn't have 4 of them, we're going to be in big trouble. But at the very least, any vehicle is going to have tires, including this minivan. That's a physical attribute of it. It's got some type of lighting, and it's, in this case, it has some glass. And of course, it's got many other things here as well. But this gives you a general idea of how we look at this van from a physical perspective. All right, so same van. Now we're going to kind of switch gears for a moment and look at it from the functional. We just looked at the physical things like tires. Now we're going to look at it from that functional perspective. All right, we know functionally this minivan has got to have some ability to accelerate. That's a functional characteristic of it. It's got the ability to stop. That's important. It's got some lighting. That's a function of it as well. And it's got cooling so that we keep the engine from overheating. You could see that there would be many other attributes we could identify with a van like this. The door opening, the windows going down, maybe the transmission working. All of those are functional aspects of this object we would call a minivan. You're going to see how we're going to apply this to your application here in just a moment. All right, so the second foundational concept is all about prioritization. We prioritize things all day long, if you think about it. And we know that actions can be prioritized. But what's more, from things that are the most important all the way to things that are least important. You and I do this all day long. So let's go ahead and use the following things to identify importance. These 4 categories you see on the screen, which is critical importance, and then transitions to a high level importance. It's less than critical. Then we transition to medium importance, and last is the low importance. So you can see there's a logical progression here. These 4 tend to cover METS really well. I don't think you'll need to use more, but if you do, it's easy to add. These 4 have covered it through the last 15 years of me using this process. We know that everything isn't equal, so these categories give you a way to do it. If you think about this, if you had to test something, you likely would do the most important things over the least important things. So I hope you see how that applies back to our minivan. Remember that our first foundation was all about identification, and now this second one is dealing with prioritization. So let's go back and look at the van again. All right, so from a prioritization perspective, we're going to look at the physical things. Remember, we looked at physical and functional. So now we're going to think about that from the aspect of prioritizing those things. Physical prioritization. Ready? Here we go. So we're going to consider those tires. Just look at the tires for a moment. So one of the most critical things about those tires is that there's 4 of them. If there were 3 of these tires on this van, we're going to have big trouble. So we put that in the critical column. The next thing would be the condition. Are they in good condition? Well, we know you can drive on bad tires. Any of us who have gone way too long on a set of tires know that. But we know that the 4 is more important than the condition, even though condition is important. Next might be the pressure. Is the tire pressure more important than 4 of them? Well, no, obviously. Or is it more important than the condition? Probably not. So in this case, I put it in the medium column. And the last but not least, in this case, I decided, well, maybe it's important to check that the tires are balanced. Again, it's probably the least important of these 4 things, considering they were some type of test. All right, we're going to do the same sort of thing instead of physical. Now we're going to look at the functional prioritization. Okay, so this time we'll go ahead and use the stopping functionality from the van. All right, so for the critical, we're going to make sure that it completely stops. That is a super important test if we were testing the stopping capabilities of this minivan. That should be the most important thing. The next might be expected time frame. Does this van stop in the time I think? Do the brake pads need to be replaced? Is it taking too long to stop? Is something wrong with the braking system? That's where this sort of test would come into play. The next would be, does it stop under wet conditions? Does it have analog brakes and those sort of things that help with this? Would be a medium test. And the low one is an emergency brake. Now, as I wrote that down, I started thinking, wow, if I lived in San Francisco, I might move that up a notch or 2. But you get the general idea here that these tests have a prioritization to them. And you're going to see how that's going to tie in to the way we build out a METS for your application as well. So let's transition now. We've got those foundational concepts in place, what it takes to get started. So I want to now focus on what it would take for you to build your own METS. So again, kind of get in your mind your application that you work with every day. Okay, and remember, this is a really simple process. It doesn't need to be overcomplicated. It certainly wasn't for me. I was just a new QA guy, and it came to me pretty easily. So I think this is really simple to get started with. Alrighty. So getting started in METS, this is some fundamentals that you need to do. There really are 2 steps to this. All right, step 1 is all about creating what I call the physical test grid. You remember earlier, you probably saw an example of my yellow notepad turning into that Excel spreadsheet. Well, I refer to that as a test grid. Okay, pretty easy. Remember that since we're talking about the physical test grid, we're talking about the things you can touch within your application. Those things like buttons, forms, links, images, those sort of things. And consider starting this list in a spreadsheet like Excel or maybe Google Docs or something that makes it easy for you to get access to. I think it's important that you can get back to this document real quick when you want to add other tests, or you can access it maybe really easily from locations you might be asked to perform a test from. Also, step back from the application from time to time and think about how's my customer going to use this application. That'll help you identify things like the facts. That's how I came up with that idea to test the 800 number. I thought, well, I see a number there, but my customer is going to dial that number. So it's important to put your brain in the mind of your customer. And try not to be too consumed when you're starting to build this with how much time it takes. Put that aside for the moment and just get your mind around the idea of capturing as much as you can. All right, So the beginnings of the physical test grid. I use, again, Microsoft Excel. That's how I started with mine. And we're going to add a column called categories. You can see it on this slide. The physical items you're identifying, they're going to go under the categories column, and you're going to just add one of them per row. Remember to start at that kind of that 10,000 foot level and write down all the obvious ones. You can see I've added pages, graphics. I'm obviously talking about some sort of web page here. Forms and links, text, those sort of things. METS is going to be a living document, so you're going to go back to it and you're going to add things to it. So I actually try not to go, I feel like I've got to fill out every single column right out of the gate. I do the ones that I think of at the moment, knowing I'll refine it as time goes on. Just write down what you identify. All right, guys, so let's talk about a sample web page here. This is from our company here, Ramsey Solutions. And look at the types of objects. Remember, we're looking at this from a physical perspective. This web page has got some graphics on it. It has got some buttons on it, 3 obvious ones, but there are actually more if we start to consider links and other things. I see a sign up button up there. We have facts. This is textual information. You know where a great place where you find facts is usually in the footer of a page, which I've cropped in this picture so we didn't see it. But most of our websites have things like that. I'm sure yours do as well. There are forms like this one that allow someone to sign up for our newsletter. We know that that's a form that gets submitted to some back-end system. It's going to have all kinds of interesting tests that we can perform on it. And then, of course, there are these links. And as a little caveat, I'm sure most of you know, just because this link says, in this case, get the podcast, behind it is actually a reference to a web page. So even if your links look like URLs, that doesn't mean they're always going to go to that URL. That's a secondary part that's behind the scenes of a page like this. So here we're starting to get our mind around physical test grid objects. So you've identified your categories. Here I've just identified 2, pages and graphics. Now what I'd like for you to do is add a title called critical in the next column over. And you can even see I've added a test there called page completes loading. This was probably one of the very first items that showed up on that yellow tablet, 25 or 6 years ago when I started METS. As silly as it sounds, it was great to have a reminder to go and check that the entire page loaded for each one. So it became my very first test, and it's in the critical column. I've added some others here as well. And by the way, just thought about this. I have a sample METS grid that's just for web testing, and it's available on my website. Just posted it there a few days ago for you. If you go to metstesting.com and you look under worksheets, you'll find completed versions, one that looks very similar to the one you saw in one of the earlier slides next to the yellow tablet. Okay, and so here again, those of you that are Excel experts, you're going to love building METS grids because you can see here where I've spanned multiple rows and things like that. This really gives you a chance to do some cool things in Excel and to make this easy to understand. For those of you that are still getting your arms around Excel, it's not necessary to span like I've done here. I've got graphics to the left, and I've got 4 critical tests. You could actually have graphics over and over again with the test next to it. That would be fine as well. All right, so here's a sample of the completed physical test grid. Keep writing down all the critical tests for each category that you've got. And then consider adding, really more consider, you need to begin adding a high, medium, and low column because these are additional tests. And remember, each column represents tests that are less critical as we go along the way. We're still looking at the physical aspects of the application. And don't stress out when you can't think of a specific test. You can see even here I've got a gap under the low column for pages. That's completely normal. It's even normal to have them maybe under a high column or a medium column, and you've got something for low. it's better not to force a test that you don't think is all that valuable. Take time to find those tests that are just really great wins for the type of testing you're doing, and then add them in there. All right, now, I am one of those people, like I said, that likes to ask the who, what, why, and how all the time. What else can I do with this? And so I decided somewhere along the way to go ahead and slice this data up in a different way, the information from the first physical test grid. In this example, I created another spreadsheet, and I just broke each test down into a single row. So this is going to look kind of familiar. If you look at the first row here where it says page completes loading, and now I've put a column called category. We know that was under pages. And we put a column called importance, and it says critical. But I've added 2 more columns. And I've added one for time required to complete this test. So I estimated it would take, let's say, a minute or 60 seconds. And I've also indicated the potential severity. And I know different shops have different names for this. I sometimes refer to it as Sev 1 defect, which just simply means severity 1, really, really bad, right, for those of you, versus maybe a Sev 4, which wouldn't be such a big deal. Regardless of what you call it, a column like this gives you some indicator that if this test failed, would it be a big deal or not? I hope that makes sense. You know, the other thing I have found as I've worked with METS is don't be surprised if all of a sudden you have this light bulb moment, you're like, aha, we had never thought about this test. It tends to help you bring awareness of areas that you might have forgotten. So again, it has a lot of additional benefits that could even help other testing strategies you have in-house. It'll complement them really, really well. But this is really a process of discovery. So, and you know, this is a great exercise for your testing team as well. We've had all of our manual testing team go through and build METS grids for all of our applications in-house. It's been fantastic, and it's really helped them to learn about the application. So let's transition now to the second step, which is about creating a functional test grid. It's going to be really similar to what we did with the physical test grid. All right, this should look kind of familiar to you. I've got a spreadsheet here, another one, and I've added a categories column. In this case, we're going to look at your application from the functional perspective and put down those high-level functions. So in this example, it's probably apparent this is for some type of e-commerce application where you might have an account, a shopping cart, some sort of store locator, maybe a product search option, those sort of things. These are functions of this application, and I've written them down under the categories. I'm again going to keep things at that 10,000-foot level. Don't get too worried about that. And remember that this can be such a great tool for your QA team. So I would really encourage you to bring even your junior testers into this process. We'll give them great awareness of the complexities of the applications they're working with every single day. So in this case, I've completed a sample functional test grid. You can see I've added the critical, the high, the medium, and the low columns. And I've added tests. So under the critical, I've added, can I create an account? Is that possible? That's probably pretty important in some type of e-commerce application. Notice over under the medium column, I've said, can a user delete an account? That's less important probably for most bottom lines than it is to create an account. So I've reduced that, even though that is an important test. So you can see how a functional test grid like this goes from very critical tests to low. Keep this process really simple to begin with. And you Excel experts out there, have fun enhancing these. Maybe you're that one guy on the team that just loves to be in Excel all day. Maybe you get in there and are able to color these METS grids. I believe a lot in adding additional dimensions like this, including coloring and bolding. You'll notice that this METS grid's got a blue title versus the other one, which was more of a reddish color. And that just helps me to keep them at an arm's distance, and I can grab the one I need real quick and be off to the races and use this in my testing. All right, so we're going to look at this this in another way, just like we did with the physical test grid. We're going to do the same with functional. We're going to flatten that out. I know that you analytical types out there really love this sort of thing. You take this information and now we make one row for each entry that was in that functional test grid, just like we did with the physical. And notice I've got my time required in there and potential severity, just like before. And you're going to see how amazing it is when you have these details in here. When you begin to add other features in most common spreadsheet applications that let you do things like sum these values, things like that, that can start to give you an idea how long would it take to actually run these sort of tests. It's really, really cool. All right, believe it or not, if you just stopped at this point in time, you would have everything you need to begin walking down the METS process. But a lot of you out there I know are saying, oh, I've got a lot of ideas. I could do so much more with this, and I'm the same way. And so when it came to this presentation, I wanted to share some advanced METS concepts with you. I definitely like to ask the so now what question. What's possible if I take this to the next level? So let's discuss a couple of those things. So ready? And go ahead and put your Explorer hat on and let's take a look at these next ones. So some of the advanced METS concepts required me to come up with some ways of thinking about the types of testing we do. And I've created a couple naming conventions for some types of testing. So we're going to kick it up a notch here and remember about those columns we added, time required and potential severity, because they're going to come in play here in just a moment. So I want to talk about three types of testing that you are likely all going to need to perform at some point. I call one direct testing, and that's testing that pertains to the obvious thing that was fixed. You know, if this was broke, they fixed it, I'm going to test this. And you've got these things that are related to it. Those are those boundary type of tests, things that might have got touched or on the edges of some functionality that could get broken, and I call that related testing. And then, of course, regression testing is a term we all use pretty freely and just means regardless of the change, these are the tests that I'm going to run to make sure that the overall functionality of the application is working like it should. Alrighty. So let's assume that you want to test all three of these testing areas. It's pretty likely you're going to do that: direct, related, and regression. So let's decide how much time we're going to budget basically to each of these sections. If you just had 100% to work with, how would you slice that time up? So I've decided in this example here to provide 25% to direct testing. Those are the things that have directly been changed. 50% or half my time to related testing, kind of those boundary tests, those things that might have broke because the developer was really close to another piece of functionality. And then the regression testing, I'm going to allocate 25% to. These budgets are going to vary depending on the maturity of your team. Every organization, if you start to use this, you're going to tweak it a little bit. That's completely normal, and I found that to be the case as well. All right, so remember we had those functional test metrics grids. We had a physical and functional test metrics. In this sample here on the page, I've gone ahead and added a few more columns. I know what you Excel guys are thinking of out there. I can tell those wheels are spinning already. All right, so what have I done? I've added a column for direct testing, related, and regression testing. And I've just created a simple way to put an X in those boxes, which means I'm going to perform, in this case it's kind of grayed out, but create an account. Is creating an account possible? I'm going to do that under the direct testing option. You can see there's an X right there in that very first row. Anything with an X is going to be a test that I'm going to run under that area of testing. So I've got some sums at the bottom where I'm doing 2 direct testing, 5 related, and 2 regression testing. Well, remember we also added that time, and so sure enough I was able to go ahead and sum up how much time it would actually take to perform this testing, and you can see that calculated under the time total. there as well. You could see how you could keep going with this idea to enhance this. Again, the Excel folks are going to really love doing stuff like this. So I also created a tool, by the way, this is in one of the worksheets, if you download the worksheet, that does some time budgeting. It's just a real simple calculator, and it took those concepts of direct, related, and regression testing where I allocated certain amounts of time. And I added a value above which said, hey, if this guy comes to me and says, I've got 4 hours, well, how do I slice that up across all these testing options? You can see that I've got a column called time utilized. That's just simply an Excel calculation pulling over those values that we created in the other METS spreadsheets. And it lets me know, hey, I still have 53 minutes left of my direct testing budget time to go perform more testing. It's just a really easy, low-tech budgeting tool that can be very helpful to a QA team, but ties directly into the METS process. Imagine this too. So if you let your testing begin, you actually pull over your Excel guru and you say, can you create a macro that would consolidate all these tests into their own sheet? Of course you can. And maybe that output that comes from there is something you hand off to a number of testers, and they've got their test set right there to go run that test suite of tests to execute. You've got some time budgeted. You could add additional columns here for the number of resources working on it, all kinds of things. This really gives you a lot of flexibility, but it's an advanced option and something you don't have to adopt right away. So here's kind of a review of what we've covered. Remember that we created a physical test grid and then the physical test metric. You can see that we've flattened it out below here on the left-hand side. We created a functional test grid, and then we flattened it out and created a functional test metrics below that. We've enhanced it. Remember, we added those additional columns for direct testing, related, and regression testing. We've blended that into this time budgeter so that we can take those numbers and actually see how long, based upon how much time I've given, how long is it going to take me to execute this, and how much time extra do I have? That would allow us to go back into our METS grid again and look at, well, I'm going to go ahead and add this test and these additional tests. We might as well use all the time you've got. But now you have a way to budget it. So some parting thoughts. By the time you're going to put some time into your test strategy, your METS test strategy, that's normal. Make sure your team buys into it and that you see them using it on a regular basis. They're going to find that it's going to really help them as soon as they start to use it. It's fantastic for a brand new QA team. If you are building your very first test strategy, METS is a great place to begin. We're using it across all of our products here. It's been fantastic to bring awareness. And it's leading us into more manual test cases and those sort of things. But at least it gives us a game plan to work through. Remember to get your Excel gurus involved in the picture as well. They'll see other ways to slice and dice this information to do some really interesting things with it. Go ahead and let METS be an enhancement to your existing testing strategy. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. This works so great in parallel. Remember, it's a great tool for exploratory testing. And here's a nugget I'd love to pass on as well. Consider that the critical tests you identify in those grids can be great candidates for your test automation engineers. That's the other hat I wear all day long. And we've really identified that those critical tests would be fantastic targets to look at and consider, should we automate this and this and this? Can you imagine if we had most or the right test there selected and we knew we ran those on a regular daily basis? The confidence it would give us that our application is working as expected. Your automation engineers are really going to love having a plan like this instead of just being sent off into the woods to figure out what they should automate. Now they've actually got a plan of attack for that. Here's another great one. Share your METS grids with your developers and your business partners. I think they're going to be really impressed that you put the time into really understanding their application And don't be surprised if they come up with some insights that are areas that you hadn't thought of as well. It's going to really be great. Also, consider publishing these to your wiki or to some sort of cloud-based site so that these tools are easily shareable across your whole team, that you can get to them easily from another location in the building if something comes up and you want to enhance it right there. So, right now, just to begin with, if you want to just start, just start with the physical test grid. This is a great place to just begin if you start in no other place. Download that off the website at themetstesting.com or create your own, and let this be this place that you begin. And when you have this printed out, have your folks keep this next to them at the side of their desk and continue to add items to it from time to time. And then go ahead and add them to the formal grid as time allows. I sure appreciate you coming to the webinar today. And again, my name is Greg Paskal, and I would love to connect with some of you through LinkedIn that are interested in using METS. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Remember that you can download METS resources at metstesting.com. And as Dave mentioned earlier, I just published my first book. I'm a test automation engineer at heart. I've been doing it for quite a long time. I just published this book called Test Automation in the Real World, which is designed to help you step off in the right way when it comes to test automation and avoid some of the common pitfalls. You can find out about that book at realworldtestautomation.com. I hope you drop me a note, and I'd love to learn how you're using METS on a regular basis. It'll be great to hear from you. And I'm going to turn things back over to Dave. Thank you.
Greg, thanks. This has been a great webinar, and I really appreciate it. If anyone has any questions they'd like to submit, and I actually have a couple here already, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit those, and we'll run those by Greg here before we conclude because we have a few more minutes available. And I wanted to note, again, this webinar will certainly help everyone understand this as an example of the type of risk assessment that is referenced in the body of knowledge for the ISTQB certifications such as ISTQB Foundation, Agile, and Advanced Test Manager. I think sometimes the terms are difficult to understand. This is a great example that really brings them to life, and I really appreciate Greg taking time to talk about them. Greg, here are a few questions that I want to run by you. I'll just start with the first one, which is, I'm building a brand new QA team. Brand new. So how can METS help me?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, for a new QA team, it's a perfect scenario. Look at this. You're probably bringing in junior QA folks. You might have one or two senior folks. And I think that the METS concept is very easy to understand, especially if you just start with the physical and functional aspects of things. So I would go ahead and get in a room with your test engineers and maybe take a simple application, one that everybody is aware of in your organization, and do a working session for an hour and say, okay, folks, let's look through this. We've got this e-commerce application. What are the things that we see here? We've got some buttons. We've got some functionality. We're able to add an item to a cart, remove an item to a cart. We're able to check out using different tender types, those sort of things. And begin to build it out. Maybe whiteboard that out to begin with, and involve your engineers. And you know, it's likely you're going to find some folks are just have that ability to look at an application in a certain way, and they could be great coaches as you're building METS for other areas of other applications that are within your enterprise. That's how I would recommend starting.
That sounds great.
Also, one other thing I thought of too, and that is, of course, when it comes to foundation stuff, I think it's important that even the courses I took to get my CTFL with ASTQB really helped me understand some basics like boundary testing and positive and negative testing, and that also enhanced the METS concepts as well.
Good. That's a great perspective. So here are a couple of other questions that have come in. One is, how do you see METS as being useful in automation testing, given your expertise in that area?
Yeah, I love this question. So, you know what, we're still exploring and still finding this out. But I've been working in automation for just a little less than I have as a manual QA. Actually, in some sense, I've been working in automation for a lot longer because I have been working in aspects of automation for almost 30 years. But in that QA perspective, one of the challenges that everybody runs into with automation is, what should I automate? How much should I automate? I'm a big believer that you shouldn't automate the whole regression suite. I think that creates an enormous amount of work and doesn't always give you a great bang for the buck. And why I like METS for this is if you just look at those critical tests, the ones that are in the critical column, and you consider those as automation candidates, because some of those may not be a great candidate as well, but you look at those as opportunities, you know that the manual engineer has identified those as super important. They're their most critical tests. And now I have a strategy to go ahead and work through one test at a time. We're in the process of taking our METS grids and then creating manual test cases out of them, which every automation engineer should be able to have in place when they're building automated tests. When you have an automated test that ties to a manual test that you can point to on the METS grid, you have got something very powerful in your hands. When you know that it fails here, you know what you manually need to execute to confirm that the automation has got a real pass there that's really found a defect, and you have something to go back to as a repeatable piece. So I love that it doesn't set us up with 500 test cases that have to be automated. It literally can be 20, 30, 40 test cases. It gives you such a great suite. Also, I'm going to talk a little more about the automation piece. And I have found from my experience that a good automated test suite across the landscape of an application, which METS likely covers in the critical grid, if you run that daily, you will absolutely be surprised at the number of defects that are going to pop up that you had no idea of. And I call this, there's a term I use called the sick child concept. All of us know when it's like when your child is coming down with the flu or whatever. They just start to act different when you wake them up in the morning. They're just not with the program as much. And automation runs similar to that. So imagine your manual engineer running this automation every single day. You have your automation guy builds it, your manual test engineer executes it every day, and they're like, you know, this test ran different than the day before. It's a great opportunity for automation to tie in with METS, and I can guarantee you're going to find some great defects using that approach.
Great. That's a great answer. That's very helpful. There was kind of a related question that came in right before that, so you'll have to see how you want to address this one because you may have covered it to some degree. But the question is, would you agree that METS would be a great approach for regression testing as opposed to testing a brand new product? I think the idea here is it great for both, or is it perhaps better at one than the other?
Are you saying is it good as a regression test suite?
Exactly.
Well, I would say that it can be useful in that. I don't know if I would use it 100% for that purpose. At least for a test organization that's maturing, you're going to find maybe other types of tests that you want to do. Remember that METS initially was put into place so that when something was given to you with a limited amount of time, you had a strategy. So you may find in your regression suite it's going to be more verbose. You probably don't want 50 pages of METS. It's going to be unrealistic to maintain like that and not a good approach. But I think that it definitely sets you off on the right foot. I don't know if I've ever gone through every single test in a METS grid when I've tested, because when I've got a big regression like that, oftentimes I've got a different approach altogether. So I think it could step you in the right direction, but I think it's going to be some kind of blend of both things. Maybe these are the high-level tests you hit right off the bat to make sure that all the major functionality is working, that you can get back to dev quickly and get any defects resolved, but you still have some secondary testing that really goes into the nitty-gritty detail.
Great. And they came back and asked, maybe to pose the question a different way, do you recommend METS for brand new applications? Is that a good place?
It's a fantastic place, certainly. based on your requirement documents or whatever, because you may not even have the application in your hands to begin with as you're building your test strategy, what a fantastic tool to start building out your test strategy to begin with. Absolutely. You already know functionally what it's supposed to do, and so you can begin to anticipate the types of tests. And remember, it's a living document, so you may find that how you interpreted the requirements and the way that the test was, you perceived you were going to execute it, you're going to need to modify it. But how cool is that? It's in some format that lets you go in and modify it right away. Imagine if it's in the cloud and you can go ahead and update it. Now the whole test team has got access to a much more accurate test. I love that idea. I think it's a very effective way.
No, that sounds great. Another question that we have is, can METS be used with COTS, with commercial off-the-shelf software?
Absolutely. It's perfect for that as well. So I think it's great for off-the-shelf software. Think about just the physical test grid that I created, the one that I showed early in the presentation. That is generic enough. It could be applied to any web application. So it's perfect for that, whether you built it or whether you bought it right off the shelf. And you know, another thought on this as well is, let's say that you're building an application for a client and your test team has got their METS grids. Well, maybe the METS grids is something great you can give to the customer for acceptance testing. It gives them now a tool that can help steer some of the types of testing they would be interested in. I think they would really find that really impressive, that you have a strategy around the whole context of the application.
No, I like that as well. I think it also helps to focus them on what is truly important and where they should be putting their emphasis as well. So that's great.
Certainly.
But can you? So we were recording the webinar, as we've noted, and we'll have that posted on the ASTQB website here in the next couple of days, and we'll go ahead and send an email broadly to everyone in the ASTQB email distribution list to let them know it's available, because I know there was a lot of interest in this and there are a number of people that wanted to share it with their entire team. If someone wanted to get a copy of the slides, would that also be possible?
Yes, absolutely. I can provide those in a PDF. Actually, the METS testing website has got a legacy version of this presentation. I gave out at Star West and Star East over 10 years ago. So you'll find a lot of the materials out there, and I'm hopeful to take this updated presentation and put some of those materials as well. But that shouldn't be a problem at all.
Oh, that's great. So again, I want to thank Greg. I want to thank everyone for taking time to join us for another free webinar from ASTQB. As a reminder, the information or the recorded webinar will be available on the ASTQB website, which is www.astqb.org, within a few days. Greg, let's stay in touch. I'm sure you have lots of great other stuff coming up that we can talk about in the future, and I invite everyone here back to their upcoming presentations here on the ASTQB webinars. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.